Hi everyone. Before we dive into today's case, I want to take a moment to introduce myself and talk about why I started this channel. My name is Kim and I have a degree in criminology. And for several years I worked inside a high security prison in Sweden. During that time, I saw the reality of crime in a way that's very different from how it's usually shown in the media. What I realized is that behind every headline, there are complex human behaviors, deep psychological patterns, and honestly, systematic failures that allow those crimes to happen in the first place. That's really the heart of why I'm here. This channel is called Criminology Uncut. And my goal is to explore real criminal cases, but we aren't just going to tell the story of what happened. We're going to look at the why from a criminological perspective. We'll ask, what was the offender's motivation? What psychological traits were at play? And what environmental or organizational failures let this happen? Basically, this channel isn't just about the crimes, it's about understanding them. Now, before we go any further, I want to give you a brief warning. The cases we discuss here are they involve real victims and real acts of violence. Some episodes will include descriptions of disturbing events like murder and abuse. If you are sensitive to that kind of content, please consider whether you want to continue watching or not. My goal here is never to sensationalize. It is to examine these cases thoughtfully and respectfully as a professional. So, let's dive into it. Think about the assumption we all make when we walk into a hospital. We assume the people there are trying to save us, doctors, nurses, and medical staff. The whole profession is built on that foundation of trust. We literally put our lives in the hands of people we've never met. But occasionally, history shows us something much more disturbing. Cases where the person standing right next to the hospital bed isn't trying to save the patient. They're actually the one causing the crisis. This is the story of Niels Högel. He was a nurse from northern Germany, and prosecutors would eventually describe him as one of the most prolific serial killers in modern European history. Over several years, dozens of patients under his care suddenly went into cardiac arrest. Some were revived, but many were not. For a long time, these deaths were just seen as tragic, ordinary outcomes in intensive care medicine. It took years for investigators to realize what was actually happening inside those wards. When the scale of it finally came out, it shocked the entire country. The question was no longer if something suspicious was going on. It was how he was allowed to keep doing it for so long. We're gonna go a little bit to his early life. So, who was Niels Högel? He was born in December 1976 in a coastal city called Wilhelmshaven in what was the West Germany. His childhood, it's usually described as stable, boring even. There aren't any documented accounts of abuse or neglect. None of the typical trauma we often link to violent offenders. He grew up in a pretty normal family of 4 with an older sister. But here's the interesting part. Healthcare was already the family business. His father was a nurse and so was his grandmother. So the medical field wasn't this distant thing to him. It was just a part of everyday life. From a criminologist's perspective, this is where it gets interesting. When we study medical serial killers, people who kill in healthcare settings, we often find the motivation isn't hatred of patients. Usually it's about the role itself. Think about it. Healthcare workers have authority. They have respect. And most importantly, they have access. Access to vulnerable people, powerful drugs, and situations where death isn't totally unexpected. It's what we call a specific opportunity structure. So let's get back to Högel. He entered the profession in 1997. He started his training as a nurse. He moved through the system and eventually landed at the Oldenburg Clinic in 1999, specifically in Ward 211. That's the cardiac surgery ICU. Now, an ICU is already a high-risk place. Patients are critically ill, often fresh out of major surgery, and complications are common. Cardiac arrests happen, medication can change a heart rhythm in seconds, and for most nurses, that environment requires a massive amount of responsibility. But for someone with the wrong motivations, it also creates opportunity that just don't exist anywhere else. So let's take a deep dive into his personal life. In 2004, Högel got married, and the same year, in July, his daughter was born. Now, for the most of us, that's one of the most meaningful moments in life. His colleagues even described him as euphoric. But something else was happening. According to his later confessions, on his very first night shift after his daughter was born, he injected several ICU patients with a dangerous substance. Why? Investigators would later argue that this was a psychological pattern we sometimes see in these types of killers. It wasn't just about harming them. It was about creating a medical emergency that he could then try to fix. The goal wasn't necessarily to kill, the goal was the moment of drama. The moment when everyone turns to the nurse who might save the day. He wanted the recognition, he wanted the attention. So let's look at his personality and some warning signs. Years later, a forensic psychiatric evaluation described Högel as having a mix of narcissistic and antisocial personality traits. He had this intense need for validation and excitement, combined with a total lack of empathy for others. Now, these traits don't always lead to violence, but in a place where power and control are always on the table, they can become dangerous. The environment actually reinforces the behavior. If you create a crisis and then get praised for handling it, the cycle just feeds itself. In an ICU, the line between stability and a crisis is often just one injection away. Let's talk about the first statistical red flags. By August 2001, the staff at Oldenburg started noticing something was wrong. The number of resuscitations and deaths on Ward 211 had spiked. It was enough to worry the hospital leadership, so they called a meeting to look at the numbers. And when they did, one detail jumped off the page. 58% of all resuscitation incidents happened during Niels Högel's shifts. Looking back, that feels like an obvious red flag, but in big complex institutions, people don't always interpret patterns immediately. Hospitals are busy, patients are sick. It's easy to explain away a statistic as a coincidence. Shortly after the meeting, Högel called in sick for 3 weeks. During that time, only 2 patients died on the ward. It was a massive contrast. To us, this is a huge missed opportunity for someone to step in. But at the time, no one followed up on it. The hospital never called the police, but people were getting uneasy. The senior physician on the ward was worried about the pattern. But instead of a formal investigation, they decided to just move him. He was transferred to anesthesiology. This is something organizational researchers talk about a lot. When a big institution faces misconduct, there's a lot of pressure to handle it quietly to avoid a scandal. So they moved the problem somewhere else instead of confronting it. In this case, that decision had devastating consequences. It didn't stop Högel. It just gave him a fresh set of victims. At first, the transfer seemed to work. Things on Ward 211 went back to normal. But the pattern hadn't disappeared, it had just changed departments. Pretty soon, a senior physician in anesthesiology started noticing the same thing. Högel was always around during emergencies. He was there when blood pressures dropped or hearts stopped for no reason. Again, in a hospital, emergencies happened, but a subtle pattern was emerging. And the staff were starting to feel it. It starts as an intuition, small things that feel out of place. But in these systems, those suspicions often stay unspoken for a long time, unfortunately. By September 2002, the bosses at Oldenburg had enough. They confronted Högel. They didn't call the police, though. Instead, they gave him an out. He could either resign with 3 months' salary or take a job in logistics where he wouldn't be around patients. This is a classic institutional move. It's about reputation and uncertainty. If you aren't 100% sure you can prove a crime, you just try to make the person go away. But with someone truly dangerous, that strategy assumes the behavior will stop once they leave the building. And yeah, that is a very dangerous assumption. They even wrote him a letter. Before he left Oldenburg in October 2002, Högel got something that still shocks people today. A reference letter. Yeah, he got a reference letter. The director of nursing described him as diligent and autonomous. She praised his dedication. This letter was his ticket to a new job. It allowed him to apply to other hospitals without anyone knowing about the suspicions left behind. This is a massive systematic failure. The information about the risk he posed did not follow him. By December 2002, Högel was working at the Delmenhorst clinic. To them, he looked great on paper. Of course, why wouldn't he? He had experience, he was a cardiac specialist, and he had a glowing reference. But it didn't take long. Emergencies went up. Unexplained heart rhythm issues became common. And once again, it was usually on Högel's shifts. At first, people made excuses. The patients are already sick, they said. But eventually, the staff started distancing themselves from him. He had been respected at first, but that respect was turning into unease. Then came a major clue. they found 4 empty ampoules of a drug called imalin on the ward. Now, this is a drug used to test heart rhythms, but it can be very dangerous. The thing was, no doctor had prescribed it. Even then, they didn't call the police. It shows you how hard it is for an organization to move from something is weird to we have a criminal in the act. So this went on for years, until June 2005. A colleague finally saw him. She saw Högel manipulating a patient's syringe pump, giving them imalin without any authorization. This was the smoking gun, as they said. There was no more ambiguity. They called the police, and that summer, Niels Högel was arrested. At that time, the police thought they were dealing with one bad act by one nurse. They had no idea they were opening the door to one of the biggest murder investigations in history. Because the further they looked back, the more bodies they found. After the arrest in 2005, the case felt small. Misconduct, a dangerous injection. But as the police started talking to his old co-workers at Delmenhorst, a much darker picture came together. People talked about how he was eager during emergencies. They even had a nickname for him, Resuscitation Rambo. He would literally push people out of the way to take over when a heart stopped. People thought it was just intensity or confidence, but criminologically we see it differently. If you cause the crisis, you want to be the one to solve it. It's all part of the same cycle. The investigators looked at the ward's records, and the numbers were terrifying. Between 2003 and 2005, the death rate on the ward had basically doubled since Högel arrived. In 2005 alone, 73% of the deaths happened on his shifts. Now, stats don't prove murder in court, but they tell a story that cannot be ignored. The police had to look at every suspicious death at Delmenhorst, but hospitals are hard places to investigate. People die there every day. Determining if a death was natural or induced years after the fact is incredibly difficult. Records were thin, witnesses' memories were fading, and the biggest problem, many of the patients had already been buried or cremated. The physical evidence was disappearing. By December 2006, they had enough to convict him of voluntary manslaughter in one case. He got 5 years. In 2008, after an appeal, that was increased to 7.5 years and a lifetime ban from nursing. For a while, everyone thought that was it, case closed. But the numbers still didn't add up. There was still too many coincidences. In January 2014, authorities reopened the case. This wasn't just about 1 or 2 deaths anymore. They were looking at everything. They formed a task force called Cardio. Their mission was to find out exactly how many people Niels Högel had killed. This is one of the most intense parts of the story because so much time had passed. They had to dig up the bodies. Over several years, they exhumed 134 people from 67 different cemeteries across Germany, Poland, and Turkey. They were looking for traces of medications in the tissue, but science has limits. For 101 other patients, they couldn't do anything because the bodies had already been cremated. The evidence was gone forever. When the prosecutors confronted Högel with the new evidence, he started to break. He admitted to at least 90 unauthorized injections. He explained that he wanted to feel that moment when his colleagues looked to him during an emergency. He wanted to be the hero. He admitted that in many cases his heroic efforts failed and the patient died. In 2015, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. In Germany, life doesn't always mean forever, but because of the exceptional severity of his guilt, it's unlikely he will ever be released. By 2017, the final estimate was that he was responsible for at least 106 deaths. He is likely the most prolific serial killer in German modern history. So how does this happen? That's the question we always come back to. From a criminological perspective, it's never just one thing. It's a mix of psychology, opportunity, and systematic failure. Within the psychology, we will talk about the hero syndrome. Högel had narcissistic and antisocial traits. He didn't see patients as people, he saw them as instruments, a means to an end to get what he wanted, attention and status. This is hero syndrome. You create the fire so you can put it out. In his case, he created the cardiac arrest so he could be the resuscitation Rambo. We call this typology for angels of death. And we categorize people like Högel in this typology. These killers use their professional access to harm the people they are supposed to protect. It's a high opportunity, low suspicion environment. If you kill someone in a dark alley, it's a crime. If you kill someone in an ICU, it looks like a complication. But we have to look at the system too. There was institutional silence. People were afraid to speak up or cause a scandal. And there was the normalization of deviance. Deaths are common in an ICU, so people start to see even weird statistics as just part of the job. They explain away the red flags until the red flags become the new normal. Today, Niels Högel is in prison, but for the families, the damage is done. Over 100 people died because they trusted a system that failed to watch the person they entrusted with their lives. So what is the biggest lesson here? Sometimes the danger isn't just the individual. It's the silence that lets them keep going. Thank you for watching this episode of Criminology Uncut. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this case. Do you think the hospital should be held more responsible for the glowing reference letter? Let me know in the comments. If you found this analysis helpful, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel. I'm Kim, and I'll see you in the next case.